Have you ever felt like you're too close to your own problems? Like you're so zoomed in, you lose perspective? Like you're walking around with these tunnel vision glasses on, and your day-to-day life, your responsibilities, your routine, they're all crushing you when you become this spiteful, this bitter person, and frankly, you're on this slippery slope of becoming a bit of a prick. No? Just me? Well, I wrote a song about just that. The song is called Look Up and it's available to stream on all streaming platforms, but that's besides the point. Today, I want to talk to you about how I designed and illustrated the album art for the release and break it down into 5 different steps that you yourself could follow if you ever need to create your own artwork for a music release, for your band, or for someone else's music release if you work as an artist, whatever the case may be. But before we dive in, hi, I'm Yellow Sleeves, and if you're new here, I'm a product designer by trade, but I also moonlight as an indie artist, and I write, record, and produce mostly rock music over here in my little home studio in Edinburgh, Scotland. And besides doing all of the music-related stuff, I also design and illustrate all the artwork that I use for my music releases, and that I also use for merch and basically anything else that needs designed or illustrated. With all of that out of the way, let's finally talk about the 5 different steps that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. So, step number 1 is understanding the brief. Before committing any pen to paper, you really need to understand what the song or the album is about, what it represents, what sort of feelings it evokes, what the themes are, what it's going for, and understand the context around the music so that your artwork can serve it. As a designer, I preach understanding the problem space you're working with and the problem itself before you start trying to solve it, because at the end of the day, you can't solve a problem you don't understand. And it's exactly the same thing for artwork. The artwork needs to serve the music, and you as an artist need to do your best to make that happen. So with that in mind, let me tell you a little bit more about Look Up as a song and the messages it's going for, because it's crucial for the artwork. This song is about someone, and that someone is having a bit of a hard time. When I wrote the song, I was finding myself walking around the beautiful city of Edinburgh with that tunnel vision I described at the beginning of the video, not really taking anything in, not having any sense of perspective, not really being aware of my environment or interacting with my environment. I felt that I built this sort of cocoon around me, this sort of a bubble of trying to focus on my work and trying to be efficient with my free time and trying to do all of these sort of things and chasing this and chasing that, and not really taking a step back and just saying, wow, I actually made some progress in my pursuit of whatever I was pursuing back then. So this song was really written for me to tell me that I should take a step back and look up and appreciate how far I've come and try not to allow myself to become bitter and spiteful, because I kept building this sort of walls to keep me into this routine and on this sort of a treadmill. So despite the aggressive and harsh tone and sound of the song, I really wanted it to have this positive message. So now that we have an idea about what the song is about and the meaning behind it and the message it's trying to convey, we can start committing pen to paper. But we're not going to be doing any drawing just yet. We're going to start writing some ideas. What will the artwork actually be? What sort of stuff are we gonna draw? So how about we take some pen and paper and start writing down some ideas, some checkpoints that we want the artwork to hit as we draw it. Right, so we know what the song is about, we know what message it's trying to set out, we know what emotions it's trying to talk about, so let's see how we can visually represent that. The first thing that comes to mind is something somewhat looking down and some way of conveying an inability to look up. There's an obstacle, there's something that's holding the character, the protagonist, from looking up. I'm thinking either a person looking down or a head looking down, but I'm also thinking that might not be rock and roll enough, and this is a rock and roll song. So what can make that a little bit more rock and roll? Well, how about we're thinking of adding a skull instead, and it's looking down. At the end of the day, what's more rock and roll than a skull, right? Okay, so what can prevent the skull from looking up? Well, I'm thinking something like either ropes or chains. And this can represent the skull, the person, the protagonist wanting to look up, but there's just something that's keeping them down. So this is a form of an obstacle. And then we have the obstacle coming from somewhere, somewhat, somehow. I'm thinking the skull is looking down and it's missing the big picture. So what is the big picture? So I'm thinking the big picture can be abstracted a little bit. I don't want anything that's too in your face. Maybe the skull is looking down into something like a void, a darkness, a form of abyss. And maybe these ropes and chains are coming out from that abyss. These chains, they're stemming from an abyss, or a void, or a darkness. Because of that, I want this to sort of create some form of a contrast. So I'm thinking, what if this is obviously a darker sort of color, and maybe the big picture is bright, bold, light colors. So then the skull is looking down, it's held in place by these chains, and it's made to stare at this abyss or this darkness that's represented by some dark colors. And outside of the frame, outside of that tunnel vision, we have the big picture, which is these bright colors. And that's about it. We'll probably want artist name and song title. That's pretty much it for the concept. So let's move to step 3. Right, so now that we have an idea what we want to draw next, and we have an understanding of all of the different elements we want present in the artwork at a conceptual level, not everything might work out, we can finally go into step 3, which is drawing thumbnail sketches. And thumbnail sketches are called thumbnail sketches because they're meant to be small, the size of a thumbnail, and they're meant to be quick, not very detailed. They're meant to be throwaway sketches that are just going to help you figure out the composition, figure out the elements, where are they going to go in the page, how are they going to interact with each other, what sort of size relationships they're going to have, and so on and so forth. If you want to learn a little bit more about artwork for music releases, single, EPs, that sort of thing, I made this video where I talk about several things that you should focus on when you're making artwork for digital releases and what makes good album covers in the digital world. So let's have a look at the thumbnails. I tend to do my thumbnails in this little A5 sketchbook. I've been drawing in this sketchbook for many years now, and I've done all sorts of different sketches along the years. And these are the 2 different thumbnails I've done for this particular piece. I initially thought about having a person staring down into this sort of a void represented by this cone of vision. Ended up not really liking that because I didn't want a person, I didn't want a character, I just wanted something a bit more abstract than that. So the skull it is, rock and roll baby. And once I started toying around with this idea of the skull and the ropes, I figured that I could keep the void within the constraints of those ropes, and that could signify the cone of vision. And that also left me with a little bit of space up top for the name of the artist and the song title, and I just really gelled with this. I didn't think that I needed to explore any further, and I just kind of committed. The last thing I've done was try drawing these chains by hand using a white pen and just get a feel for how much labor it would be if I were to represent these ropes as chains and figure out if it's worth doing or not. That's about it, so let's move on to step number 4. So we have a good enough understanding of what the song means, we know what elements we want on the page, and we know where we want those elements. Step number 4 is doing the actual artwork. Because I finished this drawing for the album art way before I started doing any YouTube videos, I figured I'll show you how I use all of these different tools by doing a small, quick little drawing of an owl, just to see all of these in action, because you won't be seeing them in action for the final piece. As much as I can, I try to draw on paper and start all of my artwork on paper before I commit to doing any sort of digital work. This just gives it a sort of different flavor. It gives it a little bit of a different something that is just difficult to replicate digitally. Let's have a look at some of the tools that I use. I usually start my sketch using a colored pencil. I go for either a light blue like this one or for a red. This particular one is from Cretacolor. I'm not sponsored by anybody. These are just the tools that I use. And I tend to use these pencils because they're very nice to work with and they work very well on this paper. Once I have the sketch laid out, I then ink it with one of these Pentel touch pens with a flexible nib. I've been using these for years and years and years, and I absolutely love them. And they're one of my favorite tools to do inking with. Once I'm done with the sketch and inking, I move on to using colors. And for that, I use markers, either pro markers or brush markers. I have some pro markers from back in the day when they were done by Letraset before they got bought over by Winsor & Newton. I love using markers because they're fast. The colors are quite good. They're not very messy. You can layer them really well. And I've been using a whole lot of markers back in my university days. So absolutely love using markers, especially with this paper. Once the drawing is done, to add in some extra contrast, I use either white pens or white chalk. I use these Cretacolor white chalk pencils. They are quite nice and they work really well with markers. Occasionally I use these Posca paint markers as well. They can be fairly good, but they're a little bit too transparent for my liking. And the absolute very best white pen I've ever worked with is this Uniball Signo, or however you read that. And these are absolutely fantastic, but the ball clogs pretty often. So mileage varies. So here's a drawing. I decided to not do a whole lot with the actual void. I figured I can do all of that in step 5. I did use some acrylic paint for this sort of magenta-y kind of color because the marker was actually dying on me, so you can see the nice texture over here. But I didn't want to cover all the texture because I figured I could reuse some of this sort of texture digitally. I wanted the skull to contrast with the background, and I figured a cool color would contrast quite well with the very hot color that we have over here. So I went with this sort of a blue, but I also added in all sorts of different purples, some yellows. I tried to add a splash of all sorts of different colors, different textures, different lines, just because it adds a little bit more energy, it adds a little bit more life into the drawing. Haha, it's a skeleton. You know what I mean. And that's about it for step 4. Let's have a look at step 5. So we have a piece of art that we're happy with, and the only thing that's left to do now is step number 5, which is finishing it off and adding all the little bells and whistles and getting it ready to be sent to distributors, added to YouTube, printed on vinyl, whatever you want to do with it. The paper drawing I took as far as I thought was reasonable from a time perspective and effort perspective, and there are a few things that I would want to change. So the first thing I've done was taking the drawing and scan it, and the first scan wasn't very good. It was offset, and you can see over here I'm missing all of the bottom bit. So I had to scan it a second time, which is this. Once everything was scanned, the first thing I tend to do, as you can see there's a bit of a difference in color in between these two images, is to do a quick adjustment to get the drawing to something closer to what's on paper, because scanners tend to bleach out the colors a little bit because of the really bright backlight that they use. First thing after that I've done was splitting the image into the different elements that it's made out of. If I toggle a white canvas over here, we can start having a look at the various elements. The background, this is what it ended up looking like. This is what the darkness ended up looking like on its own. We have the background chains, because in front of the background chains we have the skeleton. And in front of the skeleton, we have the foreground chains. And then we have graphics, some textures, and some other finishing bits and pieces. So let's have a look at what I've done with the skeleton. The skeleton looked like this on paper, but I needed to tidy it up, and that's what I've done next. After that, I realized that the color of the skull and the skeleton in general wasn't really inspiring, and what I wanted was something to contrast with the magenta background that's about to come. So I made the skeleton blue by using a color balance layer and pushing my colors a whole lot more towards blue and cyan and magenta than they were before. After that, I've made it all a little bit brighter with some levels. As far as the background is concerned, I had two different passes. The first pass was just extracting the background as it was, and after that I started covering up the various bits and pieces that I didn't quite like enough. I duplicated the left-hand side top corner to the right. I made it a little bit lighter, but the color wasn't quite what I wanted, so I used a color layer to change it into this more of a magenta type of shade. Then I started adding a little bit more texture here and there. I started tidying it up a little bit more around there, and then some extra texture. After which I started the second pass on the background, where I realized that actually the skeleton is lit by the top right corner, and the left-hand side corner wasn't where the light was coming from, and this kind of looked like a bit of a roof, and I didn't like that. So I figured I need to cover up the left-hand side top corner, which is what I did. Darken it a little bit more, darken the bottom light of the image quite a bit more. Then I just started adding all sorts of different textures. Started adding some brush strokes just to mimic that sort of a texture I got by using a dyeing marker. More texture, some level adjustments, more texture. At this point, everything was too saturated and too bright, so I made everything a little bit less saturated, and you guessed it, some more texture again. Then I've done the darkness. The darkness was fairly straightforward. I decided to go with this sort of a dark teal kind of color, darkened it a little bit further, lightened the top, added a little bit more texture with some textured brushes, did a little bit of contrast adjustment with a levels adjustment layer, and then lightened the bit around the skull a tiny bit more because it felt like it was kind of losing its silhouette a little bit, and I just need a little bit more contrast here to just draw the audience into the face of the skull a little bit more. Background chains are fairly self-explanatory. For them, I used a chains. It's a custom brush, and it made my life a whole lot easier. I used this sort of a dark, kind of reddish sort of color that I then darkened, and then I added a little bit of lighter tones at the top and darker tones towards the bottom. Once all of that was done, it was time for the foreground chains. First thing I've done was lay out the chains using the custom brush. Once that was done, I needed to go and trace by hand the outline of the chain so that it works with the rest of the image. Once that was done, I started playing around with the contrast a little bit, adding a little bit of shading here and there, darkening the bottom left, and I also added a drop shadow so that it looks like the chains are actually on top of the skull, and then changed the color a little bit because everything was kind of merging together between the grayish bluish skull and the gray of the chains. Didn't really work very well, so I experimented a little bit with this more brownish color. Finished off the white lines at the top and at the bottom, and that's about it for the chains. At this point, we're pretty much there. The only thing that I needed to do is add a little bit more contrast to the skull because it felt like it was a little bit flatter than what I wanted. And this is what it looks like after I've done all of that. And at this point, we are pretty much done with the skull. Now, after that, I added the graphics. These I drew by hand on paper, then scanned it in, dropped it into the file, pretty much done. And lastly, I added in this texture to make it look like this was a vinyl cover that started getting worn on the edges of the cardboard. Next up, a whole lot more texture. As you can see, there's the different splotches that I added in, and I also added two texture images that are very subtle but just does quite a bit to bring everything together and make it gel a little bit more rather than it looking like several different digital art bits kind of squashed together. And last but not least, the finishing touches. What I tend to do at this point is I take all the layers, merge them into a single layer, and then I duplicate that and I run a noise filter on top of it. Now this is extremely subtle, as you'll be able to see when I'm zoomed in a whole lot. This looks a tiny bit washed out and a tiny bit softer, and then the grain adds just a tiny bit more grit. Also, please notice the really nice texture that just drawing on paper has. This is what the scan looked like, and you can see that the marker lines and the pens, they just have this way of interacting with the paper that gives a result that's really nice. And especially the chalk left all of this texture over here that, sure, you can replicate digitally, but there's just something about it that has an energy that I struggle personally to capture with digital tools. After that was done, I figured that the bottom left-hand side corner was looking a little bit too clean, so I added a little bit more texture down there, and a brightness and contrast layer just to push the contrast a little bit, bring everything together a little bit more. A final color balance layer. It felt like this bit was a little bit too blue and I wanted it a little bit more green, just because green and magenta are pretty much at opposite ends of the color wheel, and I didn't want it to be exactly at the opposite end, but a color from around here-ish with a color from around here-ish looked like would offer a really nice contrast. Darken the bottom a little bit more so that the name of the album stands out a little bit better, and that is pretty much it. A lot of bells and whistles added a lot of polish happening in the digital realm, but if I didn't have a strong enough foundation on paper, I don't think I would have gotten results that are as good. So that's pretty much it, and I'm quite pleased with the result. It was a fair bit of work, and I'm pretty happy with where it ended up. And there we have it. 5 different steps that hopefully you can follow along with and create your own artwork for music releases. If you enjoyed this video and you made it this far, please consider subscribing. This is a very small channel and I'm very keen on growing it, and subscribing really is the best way to support me and my work. And thank you very much for watching, and until next time, have a good one.
Is what I need. You gotta lift your head to be seen. Step up is what I need. You gotta lift your head to be seen.